Imagine the most powerful naval force in human history, deploying 15 advanced warships and 10,000 troops to lock down the world's most critical economic artery. Now, imagine them being completely outmaneuvered, not by hypersonic missiles, but by a 36,000-ton ghost ship flying the flag of a landlocked African country. Welcome to the death of traditional naval supremacy. This is not just a military embarrassment, it is the moment the global geopolitical order quietly shifted. Let me start with geography, because in the brutal arithmetic of global power, geography is destiny. And right now, nobody in Washington seems to have properly reckoned with the geographical trap they just walked into. Look at the map. The Strait of Hormuz is exactly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. To put that in perspective, that is less than the distance between Manhattan and JFK Airport, and through that claustrophobic gap of dark water, every single day flows 20% of all the oil on planet Earth. I am not talking about 20% of Middle Eastern oil, but 20% of the liquid energy that every nation, every factory, and every logistics network on this planet burns every single day. The industrial economies of Japan, South Korea, China, and India, nations that collectively house nearly half the world's population, are existentially dependent on what moves through those 21 miles. I have studied global choke points my entire professional life. I have looked at the Fulda Gap, the Bosporus, the Bab el-Mandeb. None of them, absolutely none of them, carry the catastrophic weight that the Strait of Hormuz carries in terms of raw economic consequence. If you completely severed this artery, energy analysts project that the cascading shockwaves would evaporate upwards of $10 billion in global GDP every single day. Whoever controls those 21 miles controls something that comes very close to the physical oxygen supply of modern industrial civilization. And Iran has always known this. Since the 1980s, they have weaponized this geography. Let me take you back to the tanker war during the Iran-Iraq conflict, specifically 1987. The United States launched Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War, just to keep this exact same stretch of water open. Washington threw aircraft carriers and cruisers at the problem, and yet they still found themselves bogged down in a deadly game of maritime whack, a mole against retrofitted speedboats and crude sea mines. Fast forward 4 decades, and the trap has not changed. It has only grown tighter, because here is the critical fact that is being almost completely ignored in Western mainstream coverage. Iran's territorial waters extend directly into both shipping lanes of the strait. Let me say that again, as clearly as I can. Every single vessel that transits the Strait of Hormuz, inbound, outbound, tanker, container ship, or naval vessel, passes through Iranian territorial waters. That is not a geopolitical metaphor. That is not diplomatic hyperbole. That is ironclad maritime law. Think of the strait not as a highway, but as a long, narrow hallway where the floorboards belong entirely to your adversary. You cannot police a hallway when every step you take to enforce the rules constitutes a home invasion. Iran has spent the better part of 4 decades bleeding through proxy wars and absorbing crippling sanctions to make absolutely certain that every major world power understands precisely what that means. We are witnessing the catastrophic gap between a loud political declaration made in a press briefing room and the cold operational reality of the ocean. In the theater of global hegemony, you can print $1 trillion to fund a navy, but you cannot print a new ocean, and you certainly cannot rewrite the map. Now, go back to February 28, 2026. United States and Israeli forces launched strikes on Iranian territory. I am not here to litigate the justification for those strikes right now, though God knows that conversation needs to happen. What matters for this story is the Iranian response, because it was the one response that caused every oil market on earth to convulse simultaneously. Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz. They did not do it symbolically. They did not do it partially. They ground transit to a near total halt, taking a daily flow of approximately 138 vessels and crushing it down to essentially zero. For weeks, diplomats scrambled, back channels opened. The United States and Iran began a series of grinding, desperate negotiations in Islamabad, searching for some face-saving formula. And then on April 12th, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance walked out of those talks empty-handed. The talks collapsed. Hours later, Donald Trump's response echoed across the globe. He announced a total naval blockade. He deployed 15 warships and 10,000 military personnel with explicit orders to stop and turn back any vessel of any nation attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports. Washington treated this announcement like a decisive checkmate. But I want you to look at the immediate reaction of America's closest Gulf ally, because this is where the tectonic plates of global power actually started fracturing. Saudi Arabia, a country that has built its entire modern existence and its entire defense architecture around the United States security umbrella, did not cheer. They quietly and frantically began pressuring Washington to lift the blockade and return to the negotiating table. Why? Because the Saudis were doing the math that Washington seemingly ignored. Oil exports account for roughly 40% of Saudi Arabia's gross domestic product and over 70% of its total export earnings. Their entire economic survival is tethered to the free flow of those tankers. If Iran responded to the American blockade by simply extending its shutdown to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, Saudi oil exports do not just slow down, they die. They flatline entirely. For decades, Washington has treated the Middle Eastern alliance system like an obedient flock, assuming the Gulf states will always fall in line behind American dictates. But Saudi Arabia was watching an American president make a unilateral declaration that put the very existence of their national economy at catastrophic risk. The American security umbrella, originally designed to protect them from the storm, had suddenly transformed into a giant lightning rod, deliberately attracting a deadly strike. Think about that. The next time someone in Washington tells you the Gulf states are firmly in America's corner on this issue, they are not. A superpower's alliance system is only as strong as the mutual survival it guarantees, and an empire begins to fracture the exact moment its protection becomes more dangerous than the threats it claims to fight. Now, keep watching, because this is where the story abruptly shifts from grand geopolitics to the granular, shadowy world of maritime tradecraft. And the tradecraft here is something that I find genuinely impressive from an intelligence standpoint, even as it exposes a catastrophic failure in American strategic planning. Let me introduce you to the architecture of the United States humiliation. It is called the Rich Star. She is a medium-range tanker, 36,000 deadweight tons, originally built in 2018. The U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control actually blacklisted her in 2023 specifically for evading energy sanctions. But tracking her ownership structure is like peeling an onion made of shell companies. Ultimately, the paper trail dead ends at the Shanghai Swan Shipping Company. We are looking at Chinese ownership, a Chinese crew, Chinese cargo routes, and a corporate operational discipline specifically engineered to not be found. Here is the first piece of the puzzle that almost no major news outlet is explaining correctly. As the Rich Star sat in the Gulf, the flag flying from her mast was the flag of Malawi. Let that sink in. Malawi is a landlocked nation in southeastern Africa, a country with no coastline, no deep water ports, and officially no active registry for ocean-going vessels. This is not an administrative oversight or a cost-cutting measure. In the brutal calculus of maritime law, without a legitimate flag state, there is no government with legal jurisdiction over the vessel. There is no ambassador to summon, no country to pressure, no treaty framework to invoke. It is, in the most precise legal sense, a ghost ship wearing a costume designed to make it jurisdictionally invisible, but the flag is just the window dressing. What the Rich Star did between April 3rd and April 14th, the 11 days running directly into the teeth of the American blockade, should keep every Western intelligence director awake at night. The ship was professionally spoofing its automatic identification system, or AIS. For those unfamiliar, AIS is the maritime equivalent of a commercial airliner's transponder, the foundational data layer that the entire global maritime tracking infrastructure relies upon. For 11 straight days, the Rich Star broadcasted a digital ghost, showing herself sitting peacefully in a non-Iranian port. In physical reality, analysts later concluded she was almost certainly docked at Karg Island, Iran's primary offshore oil terminal, loading a massive cargo. This is not amateur hour. This is the Shadow Fleet. And if you do not understand the Shadow Fleet, you do not understand the 21st century global economy. Prior to 2022, this dark web of international shipping was relatively contained, mostly servicing Iran and North Korea. But when Washington dropped the hammer of financial sanctions on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, they did not isolate Moscow. They inadvertently poured rocket fuel on this underground ecosystem. Today, maritime intelligence estimates that this decentralized armada has swollen to over 1,000 vessels. By some industry estimates, they move upwards of 7 to 8 million barrels of oil every single day. That is nearly 8% of total global consumption. An underground economy worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, operating completely blind to Western regulators, utilizing cargo laundering and fake registries to remain immune to the US dollar. Think of the Western financial system and its sanctions regime as a heavily armed, impenetrable fortress. Washington keeps pouring billions into reinforcing the steel gates, entirely oblivious to the fact that Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran have spent the last half-decade quietly excavating a massive, high-speed subterranean tunnel network right beneath the foundations. They are not trying to storm the gates. They are simply emptying the vault from below. The United States military did not deploy 15 warships to stop an enemy navy. They deployed them to stop a decentralized algorithm, an untraceable shell company, and a spoofed radio signal. And as Washington is painfully learning, you cannot sink a digital phantom with a Tomahawk missile. Let me tell you exactly what happened when the blockade officially came into force on Monday afternoon. Almost immediately, Central Command began issuing statements painting a picture of total control. During the first 24 hours, they proudly announced that no ships had breached the perimeter, and that 6 merchant vessels had dutifully complied with directions from United States forces. The narrative fed to the media was simple: the blockade is working. But having spent years reading intelligence assessments, I can tell you that statement was only technically accurate in the narrowest, most carefully massaged sense. From a strategic standpoint, it was dangerously misleading, because while Washington was busy counting its compliant vessels and drafting triumphant press releases, the Rich Star was quietly making its move. Central Command's formal, legally vetted language stated they would not impede vessels transiting to and from non-Iranian ports. Non-Iranian ports. Those 3 little words formed a legal loophole wide enough to drive a 36,000-ton ghost ship straight through. The Rich Star loaded its cargo of 250,000 barrels of methanol at Humriya. Humriya is in the United Arab Emirates. It is not an Iranian port. Therefore, by the precise legal definition of the blockade drafted in Washington, the Rich Star was not breaking any rules. It was operating in complete, weaponized compliance. But how does sanctioned Iranian energy end up on a Chinese-owned ship in an Emirati port? Welcome to the dark art of cargo laundering. This is a tactic that the intelligence community has watched evolve and perfect itself over the last decade. Back in 2017, North Korea pioneered modern ship-to-ship transfers in the East China Sea, moving thousands of tons of sanctioned coal and petroleum under the cover of darkness to evade United Nations resolutions. Iran and China took that crude North Korean playbook and industrialized it. The original methanol was almost certainly loaded at an Iranian terminal 11 days earlier during the ship's digital blackout. It was then sailed out into the gray zones of the Gulf and quietly deposited into a neutral tank farm in the United Arab Emirates. There, the cargo is physically blended with other chemicals. The paperwork is aggressively scrubbed by shell companies, and a completely new certificate of origin is printed. Overnight, sanctioned Iranian energy magically transforms into a legally clean Emirati export. The American sanctions and enforcement mechanism is like a multi-billion-dollar steel net dropped into a murky ocean, meticulously designed to catch only the honest fish, while the apex predators swim effortlessly through the legal gaps. This is the operational genius of what Tehran and Beijing have constructed together. They do not need to fire a single missile to break an American blockade. They simply render it definitionally irrelevant. You see, the ultimate geopolitical defeat is not when your adversary overpowers your military. It is when your adversary strictly follows your own rules to prove to the world that you have no power at all. Let us follow the rich star as she exits the Strait of Hormuz. Because what happens next is the detail that I have not seen properly analyzed anywhere in the Western media ecosystem. On Tuesday, hours after Central Command declares total enforcement success, the rich star makes her transit. She passes straight through the choke point, AIS tracking data from marine traffic. Confirms the passage, Bloomberg shipping reporters are watching. Lloyd's List is watching. Global commodity desks are holding their breath. The ship's signal shows her heading east into the Gulf of Oman, broadcasting her destination as the Omani port of Sohar. The blockade, in the words of its own architect, just let a sanctions-listed tanker carrying Iranian cargo sail right past 15 American warships. But somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, the rich star makes an abrupt turn north. She begins heading back toward the strait. Why? Did the engine fail? Did the crew panic? According to maritime security experts, the United States enforcement posture was actually positioned east of the strait itself, out in the wider waters of the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. The rich star successfully transited the strait, sailed right up to that physical enforcement line, mapped its exact coordinates, and turned back. This is the moment the entire illusion of American control shattered. The rich star, with its Chinese crew and its ghost flag, just broadcasted the legal and geographic vacuum of American power in real time to the entire global shipping industry. Here is the military reality that Washington does not want you thinking about. Iran's territorial waters extend directly into both shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, which means any United States vessel that physically stops or boards a ship inside that strait is operating inside Iranian sovereign territory. That is not a technicality. In international law, that is a casus belli. It is an undeniable act of war. This is precisely why the Navy enforcement line was positioned outside the strait. The geographic gap between the eastern mouth of the strait and the American cruisers is exactly the blind spot the rich star exploited. So why not just board the ship in the Gulf of Oman once it exits the strait? Because China is the wall that American strategic planners cannot climb over. Consider the data. China imports over 70% of its crude oil. Its entire manufacturing base, the engine of the global economy, relies on highly vulnerable maritime lifelines. Roughly 13% of those imports originate from Iran. Beijing and Tehran built this shadow fleet specifically to secure that critical artery. If a United States Navy team executes a hostile boarding operation on a Chinese-owned vessel in international waters, turning it back at gunpoint, that is no longer a maritime enforcement action. Under established military rules of engagement, you have just committed a hostile act against a nuclear-armed nation with the world's largest standing army and the largest naval fleet by hull count on the planet. You are no longer policing a trade route. You are moving the doomsday clock 1 minute closer to midnight. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States Navy successfully forced Soviet submarines to surface, but that was a localized military standoff. Today, the battlefield is a decentralized, legally ambiguous network of shell companies, fake registries, and digital phantoms. The United States drew a massive red line across the ocean, but Beijing and Tehran simply walked up to it and showed the world that the American pen had run out of ink. Let me be clear about what this moment actually represents. The economic damage of this crisis is already compounding globally. Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope adds 10 days to every Gulf to Asia voyage, multiplying fuel and charter costs across hundreds of vessels and driving the price of everything upward in a fragile world economy. But the real lesson of the rich star is not about one ship. It is about the structural decline of an empire. Iran and China spent years quietly and patiently building an evasion infrastructure specifically designed for the day American naval power tried to assert control over this waterway, and when that day came, the infrastructure worked. The Strait of Hormuz has swallowed the ambitions of every empire that tried to declare it controlled. The reality of the 21st century is this: 15 warships and a social media post do not constitute a blockade. They are a performance. And one single ghost ship just reviewed that performance in front of the entire world, proving that true power no longer belongs to the nation with the most aircraft carriers, but to the nation that knows how to write the code that bypasses them. If you want to understand where the real fault lines of global power are shifting, do not watch the press briefings in Washington. Watch the dark water. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the Mercer Global Brief.